Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at, ladies and gents. I am Kure Isagami, and welcome back to class with another episode of my Robattle Studies 102 curriculum. It's in this specialized playlist that you'll be getting a lot more in-depth insight and explanations around a lot of the mechanics that make Medarot and ultimately Medarot-S tick, ranging from raising parts and metals to ascending them, to different natures, to the in-depth with the passives. With this lesson in particular, we're going to be focusing more in depth on leg types. Now, in contrast to your head and your arms, which are your primary form of combat, or whatever kind of designation that you want that particular model to be, leg types are almost always going to be a universal lesson. You can take one and apply it to basically any kind of class, any kind of team build. It does not matter, because these lessons will be basically universal no matter where you take them or how you run them. And for the most part, their matches will be pretty close to the same across most other games you try to play as well. Now, for the most part, as you see here, leg types also come in 7 different flavors, ranging from biped, multi, wheel, tank, float, flight, and sea legs. Each has their own advantage, disadvantage, and terrains that they're all good on and not so good on, and some general recommendations on how to use certain leg types over others. So by the end of this lesson, you'll already be knowledgeable enough to understand each of the different leg types, what they do, how to use them, and on which terrains you can master them on so that you can make the most of every movement you have and keep your speed at the absolute highest. Now, to break down the overall stat spread for legs, because they are slightly different from head and arms on the stat menu. As you see here, it is a relatively simple and similar menu to head and arms, but there are a number of elements that are changed. As you see here, item A, for instance, is armor, same with head and arms. When this reaches 0, the part breaks and it's no longer usable. Now, this is particularly important because when legs break, that's basically all of your mobility. So if your legs are broken, you have almost 0 speed, non-existent mobility, and if you're packing heavy parts, you are absolutely not going anywhere anytime soon. Now, aside from, of course, your head that you want to keep alive at all times, your legs are going to be the next best thing that you want to make sure stay protected or stay on the field as long as possible, so that at the very least, you still have some semblance of a speed advantage, even if both your arms are knocked out. Item B is in C are melee resist and shooting resist, which are the leg's overall ability to reduce damage from those respective attacks. The higher these numbers, the more damage that they're able to reduce successfully upon being attacked. Now, of course, this specializes primarily on if they graze or if they go to guard the attack against something else. So this applies across the bot entirely. If you are in a no defense state, or if you are on a guaranteed critical hit attack on the receiving end, these stats, or if the enemy is using a defense ignore attack, such as, say, pile or railgun, these resist stats in particular do not apply. Same can be said for anyone using a defense ignoring leg ability like Brew Shot or Through Fight. Item D is your evade, or your likelihood to dodge or graze incoming attacks. Much like your resist stats, the higher these are, the much more likely it is that it's going to take place. Now, to explain briefly the difference, dodging is your ability to outright evade the attack entirely so you take 0 damage from it completely. This is usually the much better outcome of the two. Grazing the attack, on the other hand, is when you are able to sidestep the attack, usually seen by that sidestepping animation that the Medarots do when attacking, and when they are able to graze an attack, they are able to drastically reduce the damage of the incoming blow, even lower than what the shoot and melee resist already would be factoring in anyway. And in addition to that, if the incoming attack is an ailment, virus, bug, deathlock, flash, whatever the case may be, if it's an ailment-based attack, if you are able to successfully graze it, you walk off with minor damage and no ailment applied to you whatsoever. Item E is your mobility, which is your base speed before any modifiers. This includes terrain, Medarot bonus, passives, or whatever the case may be. The higher this number, the faster you run. That's the very easiest way to explain it. And the general way that you can calculate your overall speed is your leg's mobility plus the heat cool stat of the part in question that you're planning to use. So I'm not going to go into the whole nitty-gritty numbers, but that's just kind of the TLDR of that front. Item F is the leg type and the leg ability. So there's usually that little blue question mark icon you see there for the more in-depth explanation. But that symbol there is going to tell you exactly, first of all, what type of leg it is, because some of them can be just a little bit deceiving, and of course the leg ability in question if you need more information on it. And then item G, as you see here, is the heavy limit. Now this is exclusive this is exclusive to legs only, and this can range from 0 to 3. Of course, this also tells you how many heavy parts that this particular leg is allowed to support before you start eating a debuff, and that debuff is a minus 5% to all stats across the entirety of the build, additively for every part over the heavy limit that's exceeded, usually for a total of about minus 15% to all stats across all parts because you have exceeded that heavy limit. So generally, it's very important that you pay attention to that when you're equipping legs, or even go around putting your team build together so you don't overload your legs, because that is the worst possible thing that can happen to you. And if your legs are broken and you have heavy parts, well, like I said, you're not going anywhere anytime soon as long as your legs remain broken. Now, with terrain advantage, this is another very important element to leg types as a whole, because depending on the type of compatibility that particular leg has, determines if you get a stat bonus or a stat debuff. Now, in particular, terrain bonuses go between 5 different ranks, as you see here. Highest being S rank, lowest being D rank. And to explain those briefly, S rank, which is the best possible rank you can get, those legs are perfectly matched, no ifs, ands, or buts, is a 20% to all leg stats, minus armor and heavy limit, of course. So that means this is going to be the best possible leg match that you can pick for that particular terrain you're fighting on, and you really can't ever go wrong with whatever you're trying to use with it. This is normally the best possible match that you want to aim for, obviously. A rank, the next step under that, will give you a 10% across the board. Also a very good bonus, something you really can't go wrong with. And if you can't S rank a terrain, A rank is your next best step from there. Usually float legs in particular, and I'll break this down in more detail later, will have A rank across the board, so this is generally a stat bonus that you really can't ever go wrong with using. B rank, the next step down, is no bonus across any leg stats. So this means that there's no real advantage or disadvantage on that particular terrain. You're basically fighting on neutral ground. Tank legs in particular are most known for using this particular leg terrain bonus. So even though it's not necessarily great, it's also not terrible either if you can't absolutely average a terrain bonus. Try to shoot for S or A if you can, but B is also a good settling point depending on the bot in question. C rank, the next step under that, is minus 10% to all leg stats. This is where you start getting into terrains that are probably not the best match for the leg that you're trying to use, and that's going to be your first official clue to decide maybe I should switch my legs for something else if I'm going to be fighting on this terrain. So generally, like I said, this is your first clue to figure out, okay, maybe this one's not going to work, let's explore a little bit and see what else I can use. But for some terrains, usually shooting for B rank or even A rank is probably going to be the best you can get. Then, of course, the last and worst rank of them all, D rank, is a minus 20% to all leg stats. Now, even though some people might be willing to eat that particular debuff for any particular reason, such as, say, a model like Sonic Stag or Dorcas that can meta change into something to completely flip the lid on a new leg type, for the most part, if you're getting into D rank terrains, you should really start reconsidering your options. Because at this point, you're going to be fighting at serious disadvantage, your legs will have no compatibility whatsoever, and you're already giving the first advantage and quite likely the first turn advantage to the enemy for anyone that is using D rank. In particular, if you're fighting competitively, try to fight for no less than A rank across the board. If you can get to S, great. A is your ideal stopping point. B, if you really can't get anything or you just can't match it with that particular team build you're going for. Now, to break down the advantages of each particular leg type, bipedal legs are going to be the best all-round leg you can pick across the board. They usually have no real advantage or disadvantage, and their stats will vary largely depending on the type of legs in particular. Boss types may have higher stats, other ones in, say, the 2-star or friend point gacha may not be nearly as powerful, but still offer good stats or a good ability in one form or another, and usually are very good towards rookies and newbies. In particular, the good terrains that you can use biped legs on is cyber, forest, grasslands, and arena. This usually is your A rank to your S rank at best, and these are terrains you generally can't go wrong with using biped legs on. Average terrains, B rank, are your foothills, your mountain, and your city. Meaning you can still use biped here, but don't expect any major bonus, and you're going to be relying on the base stats of that leg and all your stats across the board for any bonuses or passes that you could potentially earn. Bad terrains at C or D rank is Badlands, Snowy, Desert, and Aquatic. These are terrains that you absolutely do not want to use biped on no matter what, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Advantages, like I said, solid overall stat coverage. There really is no major drawback or debuff because they tend to stay very well rounded across the board. Maybe they'll have one stat that's particularly lower than most others, but they usually will comp it with something notably higher to make it easier to use. Modest mobility range usually will range between 600 and 900 depending on the leg, but your usual sweet spot will usually be between, for the most part across the board across all leg types, usually between 700 and 800 is your ideal sweet spot. If you can shoot higher than 800, great, absolutely, but try to stay between 700 and 800 for any kind of biped leg you try to use. And average stats across the board may vary, like I said. It'll honestly depend on the bot in question. So again, there really is no major advantage or disadvantage with biped legs, and it's going to vary ultimately on the terrain that they're being used on. Heavy limit for biped legs will also range between 0 and 3, also relative to the legs in question. Some may have a heavy limit of 0 but specialize in high speed. Other legs with a heavy limit of 3 may not be nearly as fast but also incredibly bulky to make up for it. Multi-ped legs are arguably going to be the next best choice under biped for a lot of different reasons. They may have a lower overall mobility than biped, but they usually make up for being just a little bit bulkier across the board, and they may have just slightly better overall terrain coverage that you can use them on at the cost of maybe being more average across the board than anything else. And typically they will be bulkier, like I said, with higher armor. Good terrains that you can use multi-ped legs on at A rank or S rank is, of course, cyber, mountain, and foothills. So these are the terrains that they absolutely can be used on, no ifs, ands, or buts. Now you're probably asking me, why do I say that they're the next best overall terrain match under biped? And that's because they tend to average and equalize a whole lot more of the terrains out that maybe biped are not very good on. As denoted here, by average terrains at B rank are Badlands, Desert, Grassland, Forest, Snowy, and Aquatic. So they're much more rounded in terms of terrains that they can use on, even if they don't get a bonus to it. And on that topic of bad terrains, they usually only have City and Arena as really bad terrains are on. Basically, anything with asphalt, they probably will not run well on. But anything else across the board, rocks, grass, cyber, whatever the case may be, you can use multi-ped legs no problem. Like I said, they typically will have lower mobility than biped on average, but they usually make up for it with better overall terrain coverage and usually are a whole lot bulkier than most other biped legs. But again, this will usually vary on the model in question. Disadvantages to multi-ped legs is usually the lack of mobility hurts overall speed. Like I said, they may be just a little bit slower, but they usually will make up for it in one form or another with another stat. And they also have a lack of good terrains, S or A rank, usually means no bonus, but if you can comp this with your passives and your base numbers, you can usually skirt this relatively well. Heavy limits for multi-ped legs usually ranges between 1 and 3, so usually, like I said, with that bulk comes with higher armor and a higher limit for the heavier and bulkier parts. So this is where you can start feeling more confident in your higher power and your higher tier parts that need a little bit of extra support in order to use them. The third leg type is wheeled legs. Now these usually will have the highest base mobility while maintaining your best overall decently balanced stats, but at the cost that they also have very, very poor terrain compatibility. But to explain those briefly, the good terrains that wheeled legs are good on is Cyber, Arena, and City at A rank or S rank across the board. Now, if again, much in contrast to multi-ped legs, if it's on Cyber or if it's on Asphalt, you can absolutely use wheeled legs no problem and revel in the fact you are going to run circles around every enemy that comes your way. Average terrains, unfortunately, there really are none, because with wheeled legs, you are either really good or you are absolutely pitifully terrible. And on that topic, in terms of bad terrains at C or D rank, include Badland, Foothills, Grassland, Snowy, Desert, Mountain, Forest, and Aquatic. So, like I said, wheeled legs will usually have the highest base mobility and the best overall well-rounded stats, but at the cost that you also have very poor terrain matching. So, the general rule of thumb with wheeled legs is if you can average an A rank on the terrain or better, use wheeled legs. If you cannot for whatever reason, or if they don't have a leg ability to comp it, do not use wheeled legs whatsoever. And usually you can comp that with another ability, like I said, or if someone has an ability that can negate terrain compatibilities to a point, this is where you can use wheeled legs. Heavy limit for wheeled legs usually ranges between 0 and 3. Again, it kind of depends on the part in question. The bigger, bulkier ones may have a heavy limit of 1 to 2 normally. 3 maybe if it's a boss type, and 0 if it's a really lightweight or if it's a fragile type that's much higher in base speed. The next leg type is tank legs. Now, this one actually had a little bit of controversy for a while when the game first launched for a number of reasons, and I'll get to those in just a minute. But the general advantages to tank legs is the fact that they have average terrain bonuses across the board, which means aside from Cyber, which everybody gets S rank on, they have no bad terrain, they have no good terrain, which means you are going to be relying on their base numbers across the board for any bonuses you're going to get. In addition, they also have a naturally high shoot and melee resist, which means that you're going to be very, very bulky and incredibly tanky across the board to keep your damage as low as possible. And as of about 1.5 years, 2 years in, they also massively buffed tank legs in particular, so that you get a passive stacking 30% damage reduction just because you're using a tank leg. And that was the big change that really brought tank legs back into the meta, despite the overall disadvantages you might see at first glance. Average terrains, like I said, the only good one they get S rank on is Cyber. Otherwise, they get B rank across all terrains, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no terrain you can't use tank legs on and expect a poor performance, because they're always going to have their average stats no matter what. The overall disadvantage to tank legs, though, is that they do have overall very poor mobility, usually ranging between, say, 4 and maybe 500 at best, depending on the leg type. Usually 300 and 400 is the sitting average for where tank legs tend to sit. And they also have a non-existent evade stat of 0. That means that in contrast to other leg types, no matter what they are, tank legs are incapable of dodging or grazing attacks at all. Does not matter what you do, it does not matter what stat bonus or stat boost you try to give them, unless it's a guaranteed dodge, which even then is very unlikely. Tank legs are going to take every hit that comes their way no matter what, which means ailment fighters are going to rain absolute plague storms on tank leg. And in addition, no terrain match at B rank across the board means unfortunately you're also not going to get a bonus. Heavy limit for tank legs will always be at 3 no matter what. They are very heavy, they are very bulky, which means you can use your very heavy parts and your high artillery parts with no real problems or issues no matter what. And usually tank legs can kind of comp their lower stats if they have an ability such as, say, heavy arms, which is a boost to their stats for every heavy part equipped. The next leg type is float legs. Now these are your better overall leg type if you want to try to keep terrain advantage as your constant go-to and your constant priority. Whereas the other leg types might have a diverse coverage across the board. Unlike tank legs, which has B rank across the board, float legs will always have A rank no matter what, minus S rank on Cyber. Usually at the trade-off of this, float legs, unless it's a boss type or just an absurdly powerful one, will usually be a lot more squishy, a little more fragile essentially, and they're going to be relying on that extra 10% bonus to comp any of their lower stats. They may or may not be just a little bit faster than most of the other leg types, but at the cost they're also going to be a whole lot squishier. Overall terrains, like I said, all of them. Aside from S rank on Cyber, they have A rank across the board on all of them, which means they have no average at B rank and no bad terrains at C or D rank. Overall disadvantages, like I said, they tend to fare overall on the lower end on average compared to their stats, and they are somewhat fragile. So if you are planning to use float legs, do keep in mind and try to keep them protected at any given time so that they aren't hammered in the next week, because they are considerably weaker and somewhat easier to kill than most other leg types. Heavy limit for float legs typically will sit between 0 and 2, but on a rare occasion you may or may not see it for 3. So you may or may not be able to use your heavy parts with float legs relatively consistently, but it's ultimately going to depend on the leg in question. So make sure you pay attention to that specifically when you're building your bot if you want to try to keep that terrain advantage in question. The next leg type is flight legs. Now, under wheeled legs, these have the next highest base mobility overall, but usually will comp it with having nearly poor or non-existent armor and resist stats across the board. In trade of that, however, aside from having the high mobility, they will also have a very naturally high base evade, which means that while they may be absolutely very easy to kill no matter what because they have very light armor and resist stats, or non-existent at that, it does mean they're going to be banking very heavily on dodging or grazing to stay in the fight as long as possible. In terms of terrain compatibility, good terrains at S or A rank is Cyber, Desert, Badlands, and Mountain. So a lot of terrains that are going to be considered very overall uneven for biped or even multi-ped legs, flight legs are going to absolutely run circles around no matter what. Average terrains, B rank across the board, you generally can't go wrong with using them on these, is foothills, grasslands, snowy, and aquatic. And of course, anything that is enclosed, such as, say, forest in a canopy of trees, or anything with asphalt, such as a city or an arena, you definitely do not want to use flight legs on for those very reasons. Overall disadvantages to flight legs, like I said, they do have very low or poor armor and resist stats, which means they are very easy to pick off if you're able to land a successful hit. And being flight legs, they also have a very unique weakness to anti-air attacks. So pay very close attention to the enemy team if you're going to use flight legs, and make sure that they're not packing anti-air in some capacity so they can't shoot you down and snipe you into next week very quickly and very easy. And of course, they also have a non-existent heavy limit, which typically will range between 0 and 1. 1 if you're absolutely lucky, maybe if you can find one with a heavy limit of 2, but they usually will comp that with having slightly higher resist stats and a much lower mobility. In general, flight legs tend to trade armor, and they tend to trade armor for speed and evade to make sure they can keep that consistently on most terrains. The general rule of thumb of flight legs is if you can't use wheeled legs, flight legs will generally be your next best go-to if you want to keep speed at the top of your priority list. Lastly, the final leg type to cover is sea legs. Now, compared to flight legs, these tend to fare just a little bit overall better with stat spread. They usually will have a much better overall stat balance with armor and mobility and resist stats and evade. So these are legs you generally can't go wrong with using as a fallback leg, but don't expect to be overly fast on the field when using sea legs, because much like flight legs, they also have that unique weakness to anti-sea specifically. But compared to anti-air, anti-sea is a little harder to find across most builds, so you're usually safer using sea legs in this respect, but again, just make sure that you pay attention to the enemy team when using it. And of course, the major advantage to sea legs is the fact that they have a naturally high base evade, very similarly to flight legs in this respect, and overall fair terrain coverage. Overall terrains that are S or A rank that you can absolutely use sea-based legs on is Cyber, Aquatic, and Snowy. Now, Snowy is a very, very difficult terrain because not a lot of leg types can use it. Minus float legs, which is A rank, which you're still sacrificing on, or any particular leg that has, say, snow type as a leg ability. So sea legs are going to absolutely rule any kind of snowy terrain that you're fighting on. And it's for this reason that gives them a very large advantage when fighting on that particular terrain. Average terrains that they're usually neutral on at B rank are foothills, grasslands, snowy, city, and arena. So these are usually terrains that a lot of other leg types may or may not struggle on, especially with city and arena being a pretty tough one in particular, given that anything that likes flying around or is enclosed may struggle with this one. Sea legs may or may not be too bad, but you're going to be relying on the base stats, like I said, instead of any passives you'd get from a terrain bonus. Bad terrains at C or D rank are Badlands, Mountain, and Desert. So anything that is massively uneven or is overall arid or hot, sea legs will not thrive in, and you're going to be facing a major disadvantage if you're going to be using sea legs in these terrains. Overall advantages, like I said, moderately balanced overall stats. You really can't go wrong with the way they spread the stat coverage for those. They will have a naturally high base evade, much like flight legs, so they're much more likely to dodge or graze incoming attacks. But unlike flight legs, usually will tend to bank on their average resist stats to keep their damage on the lower end if they aren't able to successfully dodge or graze, and overall fair terrain coverage, like I said. Disadvantages, like I said, their mobility is passable at best, usually ranging between 5 and 600 maybe. And that's excluding any boss types that may or may not come around with sea legs that will, of course, break this rule. So expect if you're going to use sea legs, you are not going to be the fastest on the field no matter what. Even if the enemy is at a terrain disadvantage, there is a good chance that the enemy probably will still outrun you no matter what. But you can bank on the fact that your evade will absolutely and very likely be higher than theirs, so you can still dodge or graze their attacks and take advantage of them having the terrain disadvantage. Sea legs heavy limit usually will range between 1 and 2. So, you know, it's an overall well-balanced leg, like I said, kind of like biped and multi in this respect, where you can use your heavier artillery and your higher firepower parts pretty reliably on sea legs with no real drawback or weakness. Now, some closing thoughts with overall leg types in particular. There may be 7 in particular, but each one has its own advantage and disadvantage. But some closing thoughts on that is all leg types matter. They have different types, they have different weaknesses and advantages and perks, so it never hurts to understand how each one behaves and how to use them at any given time. And mastery of legs will give you mastery of terrain, which will guarantee no matter what, you will always have the terrain advantage on the map no matter what, and you can maximize every last bonus that your legs are willing to give you. Don't be afraid to experiment either in this same vein. So even if your main go-to model might be, say, bipedal or flight leg, don't be afraid to mix it up and try, say, multiped or wheeled or float legs if the terrain will allow it, to try to kind of give you that experience in them and just see how well they fare, and maybe change the way the game is played, or even change the tide of battle in your favor by simply changing your leg type and giving yourself that extra bonus. Also, this is very important, mind the heavy limit. If your heavy limit is denoted by, say, 2, do not exceed that heavy limit of 2. Because, like I said, every heavy part that exceeds the limit of that part will give you a 5% debuff across all stats. This is not just your leg stats. This is all stats across the board. Your power, your success, your heat, your cool, every stat across the board eats that debuff, and it's additive. So every heavy part for a total of 3 will be a 15% debuff before anything else across the board comes into effect, and it's generally not recommended to exceed that heavy limit no matter what. Now, the other major rule to terrains is if you don't like it, change it. And that makes it, and a lot of leg types and a lot of support skills make it immensely easy for you to do so. Support skills in particular, like Dominion or Field Control, are very solid options if you want to try to average the terrain mastery out on terrains that you may or may not be really good at and still make use of your general go-to build, because they'll usually negate it or they'll change it outright to a certain point. Dominion in particular will change terrain ranks to A no matter what for all allies across the board, or you can use specific types of leg abilities that also will change your leg mastery and terrain bonuses. G Control in particular is S rank on all terrains upon a certain metaforce threshold. Adapter is instant A rank on all terrains, like a float leg no matter what. Or you can use a specific type of terrain type. Desert type, snow type, climber, explorer. Lots and lots of options that are available to you. The key ultimately is finding out which leg types do what, so that you can make use and take advantage of that. Because if, say, for instance, a leg ability of Explorer, which is S rank on city terrain, you can use a biped leg with that very, very easily. Examples would include of that one, say, Bankaran or Grand Beetle as ideas. So you already will have a terrain advantage where all other biped legs may or may not have one at best, or even none at all, and you can still take advantage of that. Also, as a final note on that, some metaforces can also change the terrain entirely, so make sure you pay attention to which terrains can and what terrains they change it to. Because worst case scenario, if you can't meet the terrain of the initial fight, try to build your team around the terrain that you're planning to change it to, such as Orogeny as an example, which is an overall enemy nuke across the team, and will also reset everyone on their own respective starting plates and change the terrain to mountain as an example. If you use that one, examples may include build your team for multi-ped legs or flight legs, so that you can try to average that across the board and put your enemy team at a disadvantage. But with all that being said, I do believe that covers everything for this particular class. I am going to officially dismiss this particular class and tutorial with everything that was covered. Much like it was with Metal Natures, this class in particular was a little more in-depth with what it brings to the table, but it's a very, very important lesson that all Medarotters need to learn and understand. All leg types have an advantage and a disadvantage, and a mastery of understanding which ones do what will be your key to winning every fight, or putting your absolute best foot forward, pun intended I suppose, in every fight that you attempt. But with all that being said, if you'd like to know more, you can follow us below on Facebook at the Medarot News Network page, or the Metabots Forever community on there. You can also join us on Discord in the link provided and in the comments below to keep an even closer ear to the ground on the action. This includes any links to merchandise, fan art, my continued 102 curriculum, or any other videos or contests in between. That's the first place you're going to hear it before it goes anywhere else. Lastly, you can also follow me on Twitter at IsagamiKura, so if you have any questions or feedback or comments, or would love just to stop in and say hello, or if you have suggestions for other things I could cover with my Robattle Studies 102 curriculum, definitely reach out or tag me with that, and I'll see what I can do on trying to make something happen. But with all that being said, as always, I do appreciate you all for stopping by, just as you always do. And until next time, this is your host, Kara Isagami of the Medarot News Network, signing out.